Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often, it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
The finding of his DNA wasn't just on the murder weapon, it was on a most important part of the murder weapon.
This evidence was the breakthrough that we needed.
The forensic evidence in this case was crucial.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science brought the most dangerous killers to justice.
A truly horrific criminal, a monster.
It's a hammer blow. You don't know how you're going to carry on.
We'll hear how some of the most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
He basically said to me, she's in the house, go and find her.
The amount of blood that was there indicated that there was a frenzied attack.
There was no reasonable explanation for them if that's why he changed his plea.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
The key thing about having a DNA profile is you've got probably the sharpest tool in the box.
I was so elated beforehand. We didn't have the evidence, and all of a sudden, we'd cracked it.
In this episode,
we uncovered and slightly disturbed 2 bones, which looked very, very much human.
A terrible discovery in a remote field where police had been led by a man who no one suspected.
Talking to his neighbours beforehand, and they said, he's the wrong man. This isn't the killer.
But he had the blood of more than one victim on his hands.
He was asked, you know, anything else you want to say? And he said, would you like another one?
This is Forensics, Catching the Killer.
We got to the scene about 8 o'clock from memory, and the SIO, the Senior Investigating Officer, had been given information by an offender or potential offender that a body had been buried in a particular place just inside a field in the plough soil.
Back in March 2011, forensic archaeologist Professor John Hunter had been called in by Wiltshire Police to search the corner of a field in this sleepy part of the Cotswolds.
Archaeologists are good at looking at changes to the landscape. They're good at identifying where things have been disturbed, where they might have been buried through vegetational change. You can use geophysics, you can use aerial photography, you can use all sorts of fancy techniques. At the end of the day, sometimes you just have to be manual, hands-on, and just remove topsoil to try and find where a buried body might be. Our work really was to try and find where the grave was. If there was a grave, and having found it, should we find it, then excavate it, follow the edges of the grave, recover the body, and recover with it all the evidence that may pertain to the person who put the body in the ground in the first place.
But locating a buried body in an area such as this is far from straightforward.
The information we got was quite limited, but that's not unusual. In our experience, when people say they've buried a body in a certain place, the chances are, because of landscape change and time and memory, it's usually not quite in that place. It's usually 10, 20, 30 metres away or in a completely different location. So if someone says there's a body here, then it may not be in that exact place.
Despite a full day of searching, frustratingly, Professor Hunter failed to locate the body.
We came back the second day, continued our small trenches by hand, using hand shovels, and then decided that it would be easier, more economical, to get a machine in. A machine with a wide bucket, about 3 foot wide, without teeth, and then just draw away the topsoil in a particular area. And the first thing we did was get this machine. We marked out an area, I think roughly about 12 by 8 metres, and systematically got the machine, and a very skilled driver, to strip off the soil at about 10 centimetres depth on each occasion.
Finally, the earth yielded the terrible discovery which John and his team had been searching for.
As the machine was skimming away carefully, it uncovered and slightly disturbed 2 bones which looked very, very much human. And everything stopped immediately at that point. Everybody rushed in and stopped, and no one touched anything. We came in with our small hand trowels, cleared away where the bones had been disturbed. They'd actually been moved from what was eventually the grave. And then we cleared away the loose soil, recording where it was, and then exposed more bones, clearly human, clearly in a fairly well undisturbed anatomy, and gradually, bit by bit, exposed what turned out to be a grave. It took us quite a while to excavate the body, and the first thing that was clear was that it was a very, very shallow burial. Maybe 20, 30 centimetres dug into hard rock, which would explain why it was shallow. Whoever buried the body there can't have known that it was going to be that hard to dig a body into the ground. The fact that it was close to the edge of the field, where there was deeper soil, plough soil, made it slightly easier, I suppose. But it was very obvious that the body was laid out on its back, but it wasn't all present.
The contents of the grave were as sad as they were terrible. Local TV reporter Rob Murphy visited the scene.
Only partial remains, awfully, missing her skull, her hands and her feet.
Successfully finding the body was only the first part of the investigation. The next crucial stage was identifying the victim.
Many people might think, well, you've got the remains there, surely you could just get DNA from the bones. Actually, frankly, isn't that easy to get DNA from bones? You have to go through a whole process. But forensic analysis and scientists looked at it, and they were, fortunately from the investigators' point of view, they were able to get a match because the young woman was on the National DNA database, and her name was Becky Godden-Edwards. And she was on there because she committed a minor crime many, many years before. But because of that, she was on the database.
Becky Godden-Edwards had lived in Swindon until her disappearance in 2003, the last time she was seen alive. Now investigators needed to understand why she had been murdered. That quest started with the man who had led them to the field in the first place. His name was Christopher Halliwell, and he was already being held by police for the murder of another young local woman. In March 2011, Wiltshire police had found the skeletal remains of a young woman called Becky Godden-Edwards. She was buried in a field in Gloucestershire. She was last seen in 2003, getting into a taxi cab one night in the nearby town of Swindon. But Becky's disappearance was never solved at the time. Could the disappearance of another young woman in Swindon 8 years later help police solve what happened to Becky? At around 9:45 a.m. on the 19th of March 2011, police received a call from a worried young man. His girlfriend, Sian O'Callaghan, had failed to return home from a night out, even though she had texted him at 3:45 a.m. and was seen on CCTV leaving a nightclub at 2:52 a.m.
Ordinarily in these cases, the first thing to do is to speak to friends, family. Is there a reason why she hasn't come home? Obviously, there are a number of reasons why people don't come home, but quite quickly it was established that this was very unusual and she'd not done it before.
Detective Superintendent Sean Memory was part of Wiltshire Police's major investigation team when Sian disappeared.
She was in a stable relationship, she had a loving family, and there was no obvious reason why she wouldn't have got home that evening. And so within a matter of hours, a major investigation was launched.
People were worried. Actually, this was clearly something different. What we knew about Sian was often we get a steer from the police about missing people. You know, often these people have gone missing before, they may have chaotic lifestyles, they might have had something in their life recently which has been, has caused them to want to disappear. But the intelligence that we got straight away, none of this was the case here. This was different.
The weekend passed with no trace or word from Sian. The only clue was from her mobile phone records, which sounded even more alarm bells.
What the police told us was Sian's mobile phone was no longer pinging off the masts here in central Swindon. It was pinging off a mast in Cadley, which is in Savernake Forest, which is 10 miles away. And that's utterly frightening because she has no reason to be there.
A huge search was launched in that area, with a massive turnout from the community to assist the police.
They had people out in horses. They had the police helicopter, heat-seeking helicopter, and some police were there looking. But news grew, and by that afternoon there were coachloads of people who had been laid on from Swindon to there. There were church groups, there were friends groups, and by that evening there were many hundreds of people who had been bussed, who either just randomly turned up or had heard about Sian being missing. You know, this had touched this town.
And while huge efforts were underway searching through 4,500 acres of forest, back in Swindon, detectives were starting to comb through the town's CCTV records. Footage of Sian leaving the nightclub is found and analysed closely.
So as Sian came out of the nightclub, she walked along the street and you could just see in the distance a car slowly pulling up alongside her, but it was out of shot of all cameras. The next shot further up the road, Sian is no longer to be seen. So there's a fairly strong inference to be drawn that she got into that vehicle, which at that point was completely unknown.
The image was not clear enough to identify the vehicle in the distance, but there were other clues the police could work from.
So one of the first things the investigation did was send it off to an expert. Could you identify from the headlights what type of make, model of vehicle that was? From that, it was established that it could be a Toyota Avensis, which obviously narrows down the type of vehicle you're looking for. And quite unusually, as the vehicle went by, you could see like a shiny sticker or similar on one of the passenger doors. Again, not particularly visible because of the quality of the camera, but quite an identifying feature. The first thoughts for the team was this a taxi? It's unusual to have a sticker, you know, sort of 2 foot by 3 foot stuck on the side of a car, but without a registration number, there were probably several hundred taxis not only working in Swindon that night, but travelling in from nearby towns.
To try and narrow down the search for the suspect vehicle further, police then called up the many hours of footage from patrol cars equipped with ANPR, automatic number plate recognition. That search led to a staggering find.
A passing patrol vehicle earlier on in the evening had passed a Toyota Avensis. No offences disclosed, but it had recorded the registration number of the vehicle, which revealed Christopher Halliwell as a registered keeper.
Who was Christopher Halliwell, and might he know where Sian was?
He was a regular complainer to the police when people either run away from his taxi or he witnessed assaults or was assaulted himself. So he was in our system, So it's a complete shock that a taxi driver who we all should trust should be the main suspect.
Further digital analysis linked Halliwell's car even more closely to the last sighting of Sian on CCTV.
The next thing to think about is Sian alive? If she's alive, do you want to notify Christopher Halliwell that he's a suspect? So do you stay covert, or do you go over and arrest him? The decision made that day was to stay covert and place him under surveillance.
In the days that follow, Halliwell is observed burning the taxi-car seat covers and seemingly scouting out remote areas. Then later, he is monitored as he buys a large amount of paracetamol from a pharmacy.
So they take the decision to arrest when surveillance team watch him buy suicide levels of tablets on the Thursday morning. That's when they strike and arrest him. We heard that a house in Ashbury Avenue, which is in a very nice suburb of Swindon, was being searched. It was clear that this was the man, he was the prime suspect, and neighbours frankly couldn't believe it. I was there doing a live report for the news that night and talking to his neighbours beforehand, and they said, he's the wrong man. Chris isn't a killer. My car breaks down, he'll fix it for me. He'd drop us to the airport. He takes my daughters to school. Yeah, a man of trust, and he was the man who was the prime suspect.
Time was passing, and so were the chances of finding Sian. So, 5 days after she went missing, and with Halliwell in the hands of detectives, they used special legislation to secure information about her whereabouts.
The provisions of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act allow for an urgent interview to take place. And that's allowed to take place if there's, for instance, someone outstanding, a victim that could be saved. So that interview took place in the car park without a solicitor, without access to his rights at the police station. And over a prolonged period, close to 4 hours, Christopher Halliwell made an admission that he had killed Sian O'Callaghan and agreed to take the officers to where he had lain her body overnight. For me, it was most unusual that a murderer is going to make any admissions. Normally, they want to see what evidence you've got. They want to take legal advice. So I think the team were extremely shocked that he was prepared to take them to where Sian was laying. And I guess initially they weren't sure whether that was going to be true or not, but sure enough, he took them to this deposition site in Uffington, stood looking down a bank and pointed to a spot where they could see the body of Sian O'Callaghan.
Immediately, detectives set up a crime scene around Sian's body and tried to keep Halliwell talking.
At this point, they return to the car. Halliwell is contrite. There's a convoy of police cars behind them. There's a police helicopter above. And Chris Halliwell turns and says,
"Would you like another one?" In the history of my career, this had never happened before. And do you want another one? What did that actually mean? So, of course, you're going to say, well, what have you got, Christopher? And he said, I killed someone in around 2003, took them to an area, stripped them, buried them in a field, and I'll take you there right now.
Halliwell then led the officers to the remote field in nearby Gloucestershire, where forensic archaeologists would unearth the remains of Becky Godden-Edwards. With Halliwell now having admitted to killing 2 women, it would be up to the police to secure a conviction. But that process was about to take a most alarming and worrying turn. In March 2011, a taxi driver in Swindon called Christopher Halliwell had admitted to the murders of 2 women, some 8 years apart, and he'd revealed the sites of where he had left both their bodies. One of them, Sian O'Callaghan, had been missing for a matter of days before the killer showed police where he'd left her. The other woman, Becky Godden-Edwards, had been reported missing 4 years earlier by her mother, Karen. Despite a turbulent and chaotic life in the years leading up to her disappearance, Becky's early childhood had been idyllic.
She was such an angelic little girl, and I always say sugar and spice and all things nice. That was Becky, and she really was a sweet little girl. She used to giggle a lot. She always loved nature. She loved animals. And of course, as she grew up, she loved reading. She loved school. She had lots of friends. She was always in the garden. She had a little vegetable patch. When she was 11, she started the big school. That was when her troubles began, because she was bullied. So I removed her from one school, put her into another school, but the bullying continued.
Becky started to self-harm and even attempted suicide.
She was then given a child psychologist to work with her because they wanted to get to the bottom of it. Oh, it was a terrible time. It was a really awful time. She then wanted to take her exams because obviously it was nearing her exams. She was almost 16. She then had to go into what they called an interim school. So while she was in this interim school, that was when she was introduced to heroin.
Becky's drug addiction spiraled out of control despite many attempts at rehab. Then her dependency took a dark turn.
I asked her, how do you get these drugs? How do you actually pay for these drugs? I have sex. I said, sex with who? You mean they pay you? She said, well, how else do you think I get it? I said, so you're selling your body for sex? I can't believe it.
Karen did everything she could for Becky. You know, this is a middle-aged mum living in a beautiful house in the outskirts of Swindon. She would go out and score drugs for her daughter, so her daughter wouldn't have to do it, you know.
So this is why every time I picked her up and brought her back home, that I would go out and I would buy drugs so that I could give her drugs and she didn't have to sell her body. It's a horrible thought. It's a horrible thought.
But despite Karen's selfless efforts to protect her daughter from sex work, Becky's dependency worsened. And after being involved in petty crime, then convicted of burglary, she decided not to come back to the family home, but to stay instead with a friend.
She said to me, Mum, I can't keep putting you through this. She said, I love you, Mum. I can't keep putting you through this. She kissed me on the cheek. And she said, I'll come back when I'm clean. And she just walked away and I could see her just walking away. And that was the last time I ever seen my daughter alive. It was awful. It was awful.
Becky's family tried to track her down over the months and then years that followed. But despite reported sightings of Becky by various acquaintances of her family, she never returned.
Even though people had said they'd seen her, there was something inside of me just felt it wasn't right. So we went to the police station and asked whether they'd heard anything, because I thought they knew her. You know, she was known to the police, so they would know. They said, no, nothing's been flagged up.
And throughout the years that Becky didn't come home, Karen continued to buy Christmas and birthday presents for her daughter, hoping that one year she might turn up to receive them.
I didn't want her to feel that she'd been left out. And even my mum used to buy her Christmas presents and a birthday present. We'd write a card out and it started accumulating. So we put them into bin bags and boxes and we'd put them up in the loft. So when she turned up eventually, we could have given them to her and she would know that we hadn't forgot about her because, you know, her lifestyle was so chaotic. But she was still my daughter and I still loved her.
And then, after 8 long years of missing her daughter, Karen saw with horror the news that the man who had murdered Sian O'Callaghan had also shown police to the grave of another woman he had killed, and Karen feared the worst. Those fears were confirmed with a visit from police.
There were 4 of them stood at the door. And I just said to him, "It's my daughter, isn't it?" And he said, "Yes. Yes, can we come in?" And at that point, I remember just going absolutely hysterical. It was just like somebody just, oh, it was just like a car crash. It was just awful. It was just awful. It's the news that nobody ever wants to hear. And I remember just screaming because I didn't want it to be Becky.
With the discovery of 2 victims, the entire community was stunned, and 2 families left utterly heartbroken. It was now down to pathologists and the use of forensics to piece together how these 2 young women had lost their lives. Becky's partial skeletal remains would not give up clues easily, but the recent deadly attack on Sian O'Callaghan would be easier to document.
So the post-mortem revealed that Sian had received a blunt blow to the back of the head, probably with a knife. There was also some indication that she'd been subjected to a sexual assault.
Halliwell was tried for the murder of Sian first. He pleaded guilty at Bristol Crown Court and was given a life sentence with a minimum term of 25 years.
Abuse is hurled at this man as he's led from the court. He walks out, again under the blanket, into the back of the van screeches off, and the mob again are furious. They run down the street after him.
But there was no justice for the family of Becky Godden-Edwards due to the way in which Christopher Halliwell, who now denied her murder, had shown police to her grave.
The only thing that led Halliwell to this body in a field was the confession he had given. And the confession hadn't been given properly in the eyes of the law. And so there was a big legal argument in private, and the judge sided with Halliwell that it wasn't admissible, that they could not show to a jury this confession. So effectively the Becky charge was dropped. They could proceed with Sian because they had DNA links with Halliwell on her body. Some of his saliva was found on her body, and there was some of Sian's blood found in his car. So he admitted Sian's murder in 2012, but the Becky charge was effectively dropped, to the horror of Karen Edwards, Becky's mum.
We were told that we weren't allowed to talk about it to anybody. The judge had put a gagging order on us, meaning that he was only going to stand trial for Sian's murder.
Sadly, there was no justice for the family of Becky. It had almost been forgotten.
And that is why, at that point, I thought, I've got to campaign now. I've got to get this case reopened.
It took 3 years, but Karen's determination paid off, and a new investigation was opened with a renewed hunt for forensic evidence to determine just who had killed Becky.
When I took over this investigation, I met with Karen Edwards and I made her a promise that I would do absolutely everything I could to bring justice for her and her family for the murder of their daughter.
In 2015, killer Christopher Halliwell had been in prison for over 2 years for the murder of Sian O'Callaghan. Now the investigation into the murder of Becky Godden Edwards had been reopened, and Detective Chief Inspector Sean Memory had been tasked with finding new evidence to convict Halliwell, the man who had previously told police where Becky's body was and who was now denying her murder. In order to be able to use Halliwell's previous conviction of murdering Sian in the trial for the murder of Becky, Sean needed to find similarities in the evidence of both murders and what the killer had done to the bodies.
So Christopher Halliwell is allocated a probation officer from Wiltshire as part of his prison rehabilitation, because even though he's sentenced to 25 years, he's still going to want to be released at some point and find some accommodation. So part of that process was he's seen by a Wiltshire probation officer. He was quite loose-lipped with her. He said a number of things to her about what had happened to Sian, which he'd not said to the police. And one of them was that he'd killed her in Ramsbury, stripped her clothes and placed the items in a pond. So we'd been in Ramsbury and we'd found lots of ponds, and we were driving back into Swindon for a meeting. We just drove along and happened to see this pond. It didn't appear on any maps, which was a bit strange. So we just stopped and we sort of tried to put ourselves in the shoes of Christopher Halliwell. Was this the sort of pond that he would have used? And as the three of us looked into the pond, right before our eyes, an object came to the surface, and we could see the heel of what looked to be a shoe or a boot. When we managed to hook the boot out and we quite clearly realised that that was the boot belonging to Sian, we then conducted a major search of this area. I think in investigations you do make your own luck, and whilst this wasn't a pond that we planned on searching, the fact that we were in here looking around at the right area, we had a bit of luck, and I wanted to be able to use the conviction of Christopher Halliwell for the murder of Sian as part of the evidence. It was much stronger to say to a jury that the man in front of you is already convicted of a murder.
Finding Sian's boot was a vital piece of evidence, one of many which helped prove that both she and Becky had been stripped of their clothing after they had been killed. Sean then turned to the items that were recovered from the killer's home, but there were over 3,000 of them.
In the shed where he lived, a spade was found, and my first thoughts were, could he have used it to dig the deposition site? Could there be some evidence on this spade? So we sent it away for analysis, and to be honest, I was hoping maybe Becky's blood would be on it or something similar. At this point, I met Lorna Dawson, a soil expert from Scotland.
We recovered soil from several spades, a pickaxe, a fork, and pieces of tape that had been adhering to one of the questioned spades. And from all those items, we were able to recover individual sources of aggregates less than a millimetre in size and analyse those individually. What soil science applied to the criminal justice system does is try to answer the where question. So where could that unknown soil that is on an item have come from?
Using samples of soil taken from the field around Becky's unmarked grave, Lorna returned to the laboratory to see if those samples matched the material found on Halliwell's spade.
We look at them using a macro lens, describe the colour and texture, and then under the microscope we examine them further to look for any artefacts, such as pieces of vegetation, hairs or fibres that might be retained within the soil. Then we take that same sample, hand grind it, and take a portion out and extract it for the organic profile. So that's the profile that's left behind by decomposing vegetation that has grown at that location. The other portion of the aggregate is prepared for the mineralogy of that sample, so that reflects the geology, so the rocks that are underneath that soil from where that soil has developed. So we get both aspects of the soil quantified, and then we can compare that with the known samples where we know they've come from, which are called the reference samples.
I was completely blown away when she phoned to say it was so unique in that field that it matched it as close as DNA to the soil on the back of the spade.
There was quite an unusual organic profile, so not just a common grass profile or a common woodland profile. This was quite an unusual signature that we got. At that moment, it really built our confidence that it was extremely likely that those soil aggregates had come from the location where the remains were found, rather than any other location. Because indeed, in that corner of the field, as it turned out, we heard after this that the farmer he'd not used this particular corner of the field. So unusual weeds and unusual vegetation had grown there, and that's why we got this really distinctive organic profile, nowhere else in the sample database.
This evidence was the breakthrough that we needed. This basically put that spade at the deposition site. I now needed to put that spade into the hands of Christopher Halliwell and also find some other evidence to support that he was there on that night.
With physical evidence made available through forensics, Detective Superintendent Sean Memory went on to seek more proof. That proof came when his investigations discovered two key incidents which had occurred in the days around Becky's disappearance back in 2003.
Through some research, we identified that on that very night that we thought Becky had gone missing, Christopher Halliwell broke down less than a mile away from the deposition site. He'd run out of petrol. Was that poor planning on his behalf? But it placed him very close to this rural location. Furthermore, we were able to identify that on the day, later on in the afternoon, he had an emergency appointment at his doctor's. He'd gone there on a non-arranged appointment. He had broken a finger or two on his hand, and he had scratches to his face. The doctor noted that he was highly emotional and didn't have an explanation as to how these injuries had occurred. But what was interesting was Christopher Halliwell had a long history of reporting assaults, criminal damages, what he witnesses as a taxi driver. He did not come forward on this occasion to say how his injuries had occurred.
Finally, Sean had the evidence he needed to bring about the trial which Becky's mum Karen had fought so tirelessly for. The Crown Prosecution Service agreed that Halliwell now could stand trial for the second murder of Becky Godden Edwards.
So I was really confident that we could get a conviction for this, but I went to see Karen Edwards and said, look, he's been charged. That doesn't mean to say he's been convicted.
But for Karen, and indeed all those involved, there were more surprises in store.
Well, we thought we were going in the courtroom, but we didn't. And we all sat outside. Next thing we knew, he'd sacked his barristers, and they'd come out and said, he's decided to represent himself. Who does he think he is?
The trial was pure drama. Halliwell defending himself, which is unheard of in a murder trial.
Christopher Halliwell, I've no doubt, conducted a load of research whilst in prison, accessing books, material about being a lawyer. I'm sure he thought that 30 years in the bar he could do overnight at Crown Court, which actually, again, played to our strengths, because as well as he thought he did, he was appalling. He questioned everybody. If you were a witness, he called you. So he called me, and I didn't know what he was going to ask me, but it was a really trivial question. He'd said that he'd picked up some drug dealers, been asked to bury a bag, and he assumed that it was guns and not a body. And he basically asked me whether I thought that was true, and was it plausible? For me, that was a really straightforward answer. No and no.
Halliwell claimed not to have known Becky at all, but what transpired through the evidence given was he did know Becky, and he knew her very well.
There was one of the witnesses who was friends with Becky, and she was called, and she was very brave. She stood in the witness box, and she questioned him, he questioned her, and she said, "You know Becky?" And he said, "I didn't know her." He said, "But you did know her, you were obsessed with her. You used to sit and watch her all the time. You were absolutely obsessed."
They had had a relationship that he would offer to pay for her to not go out, working as a sex worker. And the picture painted in court was he was infatuated with Becky.
But that was hard. Looking at him, stood there with that smug look on his face, knowing what he'd done to my daughter. I couldn't believe it. And now here he was, cross-examining other people, trying to wiggle off the hook, saying that the police had stitched him up, that they'd planted that soil on the spade. He was questioning Lorna Dawson, who is an expert in this field.
It was a very strange situation, but thankfully there was a very good judge who kept good control of the trial, and indeed had to stop him on several occasions when he was breaching the law in the type of questions that he was asking.
It didn't take the jury long to find Christopher Halliwell guilty. I think it was 2 hours. We were surprised it was that long, actually. And he was given a whole life order. There aren't many whole life orders given in the country. I think at the time he was one of 50-odd killers in prison who will never see freedom again. But he's one of them. He's an insignificant man who did something deeply significant twice, at least twice.
The satisfaction for me is for Becky's family. They'd been denied justice. They'd been denied a proper burial. They'd been denied knowing for 8 years what had happened to their daughter.
That's what this should all be about, really, about young Becky, whose mum adored her, whose brother loved her, and was just, a free spirit, and was adored and loved back, and was a big personality by all accounts. And this should be about her, not the man who took her life.
Finally, Becky's family got the outcome they had fought so long and hard for. It had taken 5 years, 2 investigations, and importantly, the use of forensic evidence to secure the conviction of the man who had murdered their beloved daughter. But it was a bittersweet moment for them.
Yeah, it was hard. We all went down to the pub and we all raised a glass. And we'd put on the Justice for Becky page. We're all going to raise a glass tonight for Becky. And it was lovely because All the photographs were coming through with people raising the glass. It was just amazing. And we done it. We done it. I'll never get my little girl back. But we got justice. We got justice.
If you have been affected by any of the issues raised in this programme, help is available online at sky.com/viewer support.